Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to have a look at this document and do a little hip statement practice with a document that is attached to chapter 27 or is related to material from chapter 27. That is the chapter on the Islamic empires. So as with any good source, as with any good document, the very first thing you want to do is check out the source. So we go down here to the source. It says, letter from Sultan Selim of the Ottoman empires to Ismail of the Safavids. 1514. Okay, so pretty clear what that is. Letter from one ruler to another ruler, the Ottomans to the Safavids. And if we look up here in the corner, we have a little portrait of, here's Selim of the Ottomans, and here's Ismail of the Safavids, two little portraits of them. But okay, so we can tell a little bit about this letter. It's between two rulers. Maybe it talks about politics, maybe talks about conflict, maybe talks about trade. I don't know. Let's find out. Start from the top. I, Sovereign Chief of the Ottomans, destroyer of the enemies of the true faith, the terror of the tyrants, I address myself graciously to you, Emir Ismail, Chief of the troops of Persia. Well, that's interesting. So this is from the Ottoman Sultan. He's given himself some grand titles here. Interesting enough, he's calling him an emir, which is a slightly lesser title in Islamic kingship. Not quite up there with sultan. I believe the Safavids refer to themselves as the Shahs, which is the ancient Persian title for ruler of their empire. So it's interesting. It seems like he's thrown a diss here, but let's see what it actually has to say. To you, Emir Ismail, you have impaired the purity of the dogmas of Islam, because you have dishonored, soiled, and destroyed the altars of the Lord, usurped the crown of the East by unlawful means. Our ulama have pronounced a sentence of death against you, perjurer and blasphemer. However, we exhort you to embrace the true faith, and this is why we address this letter to you. Okay, that's interesting. So it looks like it's calling out what Sultan Selim sees as the evils of Emir Ismail or Shah Ismail. Honored, dishonored, and soiled and destroyed the altars of the Lord. Usurped the crown of the East. So maybe the East referring to the ancient crown of Persia by unlawful means. So he's basically saying that it seems like he's saying that he sees Ismaili's rule as illegitimate, perhaps. The ulama are religious scholars. And so this probably has to do with some sort of religious justification for fighting him. Now, if we remember our facts, we will remember that the Safavids were a Shia Muslim dynasty, and the Ottomans were the major Sunni Muslim dynasty in the area. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire would eventually become the recognized caliph of the Ottoman world. That is not to say that everybody believed he was the caliph, but he officially held the title. That was the title that the original successors to the Prophet Muhammad had held. And the Ottomans would hold it until the 1920s. So this would be the head of the Sunni Islamic world addressing the sort of de facto head of the Shia Islamic world. That's interesting. Now, I don't remember the exact date that the Ottomans took the title of caliph. I know it happened sometime in the 1500s, but I don't remember if it had happened by 1514, but that's interesting. So let's say you get this document on a DBQ. Let's talk about some of the ways, some of the approaches you could use when discussing it or making a hip statement out of it. So let's think about historical context. So one of the things we always think about the Ottomans is we think about their capital of Istanbul, right? And Constantinople. So by 1415, this is only about 70 or so years, 60 or so years after the conquest of Constantinople. So that could be within living memory. And so this is sort of, we know this is in the early days of the Ottoman Empire. Later on, we think of the Ottoman Empire as like the sick man of Europe, right? But right now, Ottoman Empire is young, Ottoman Empire is powerful. And so this letter is definitely sort of the aggressive expansionist period of the Ottoman Empire. So that's something you could talk about, right? This is the early days of the Ottoman Empire. This also makes a reference to the Sunni Shia split, right? Destroying the altars of the Lord, perjuring and blaspheming. We know that Ismail and some of his successors would practice a kind of Shiism known as Twelver Shiism. And they had a practice called the hidden imam, which was a practice by which the Shah was said to be in contact with the hidden imam who would eventually bring about the end of days and sort of the end of the world. And this was sort of blasphemous to most Sunni Muslims. And so this sort of makes a reference to the Sunni Shia split. So that's kind of a big deal too. which is made clear by Ismaili claiming to be connected to the Shia imams. Now, that's not in the letter, right? That's not in the letter. But if we think about, we remember what we remember about the Safavid Empire. That's a pretty good example right there. Is the Sunni Shia split in the context of this letter. So the intended audience of this letter, well, obviously it's written to Ismail the first, right? So there we go, all done, right? No, not quite. So more broadly, this letter is addressed to anyone who would question the Sultan's power. Like clearly this is directly addressed to Ismail, but it is more broadly addressed to any of his enemies or those who oppose him, right? He's using all this verbose language, talking about destroying those who oppose him, as well as propping up his piety, right? He's a man of God, right? He's protector of the faith, destroyer of the enemies of the faith, right? So not only is he trying to strike fear into his enemies, right? Those who might oppose him, but he's also attempting to perhaps rally his own religious subjects by pointing out his piety and the fact that he's about to go to war with what some of his subjects might arguably call an infidel, right? So he's attempting to play up his piety. So he's playing up his power. He's also playing up his piety, which is typical things a ruler does. And so his audience may be those who want to see him play up his power or play up his piety. His nobles, his generals, maybe his soldiers, possibly his people, but also his enemies, right? He wants all of his enemies to know that, hey, I'm going to destroy you if you stand against me. So that's possibly there. Point of view. Now, it's hard to say. I don't know how old the Sultan is here. If I knew he was like a young and bold Sultan, or if he was an old and experienced Sultan, I don't really know for sure. But he definitely embodies the view of an absolute ruler of a powerful state. You know, he is the commander of the faithful. He is follower of the Lord. He is the ruler. Right, he's the one in charge. No one else is in charge. So his perspective is in part one of demonstrating his authority. Right, we talked a little bit about power, but now we're going to talk about authority. Right, as the head of an army, perhaps preparing for battle, he's calling upon God to give him power. Right, he clearly believes that this letter, well, his point of view is that this letter will make a difference. Right, he believes in his own authority. Right, his point of view is that as the Sultan, he is in charge. Right, and so this sort of bleeds out into his letter. He's in charge. He's righteous, and let nobody forget it, right? So if you had to write a DBQ about this and you want to talk about the point of view of the Sultan, you talk about how his confirmed righteousness might be an element of his faith in either faith in Sunni Islam or perhaps his desire to be perceived as pious. Last but not least is the purpose, right? So the purpose is arguably to convince Ismail not to fight him. Like it seems, he's saying like, hey, look, don't fight me, right? Come, let's negotiate, join the true faith. We don't have to fight you. But the reality could be to rally his own forces, right? Look, we're going to go fight them. Remember that I'm the head of the faith. I'm the destroyer of tyrants. He's not even a sultan. He's just an emir. Ismail is just an emir, right? We're going to beat him. We're going to beat him down, destroy him good, right? He could also potentially be trying to convince the forces of Ismail to desert them, right? Hey, you're standing against the destroyer of tyrants. And your leader's evil anyway, right? You should desert them, right? Come over to me, right? Not only am I pure and righteous, but I destroy tyrants. So if you come over to my side, you won't be destroyed with the tyrant, right? So the purpose is the desired action. So while the desired action may be to convince Ismail not to fight, another possible desired action would be to rally his own soldiers if we're about to go to battle. It seems like this may be before the Battle of Chaldiran. I don't actually know for certain what the date of Chaldiran was. It's the famous battle between the Ottomans and the Safavids. Perhaps this is right before the Battle of Chaldiran. I don't know. They exchanged a lot of letters over a long time. So it could be to rally his own forces by, boasting and speaking of his piety, but it also could be to kind of scare his enemies into retreating and not having to fight. Both of which could be some sort of purpose, some sort of desired action. Now, as with any HIP statement, it's always important to think about which HIP statement is most appropriate for this document. Now, I would argue that the most difficult one probably to do would be point of view. It's just not super clear. We know who the Sultan is, but unless you know like a lot about the Sultan, it might be tough to potentially make a point of view argument. I would say probably purpose or context would be the easiest ones for this particular document. But that's just me. Maybe you got something different. Maybe you thought of something I didn't even put here, right? Is like, as a colleague of mine says, there's many different ways to skin this cat. But anyways, I hope this helped you out a little bit when thinking about HIP statements. My name is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.